Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for taking the time to attend today's webinar, DuPont Protective Apparel in a COVID-19 World. My name is Catherine Breer. I'm the End-Use Marketing Manager for DuPont Personal Protection, and I'll be helping to facilitate today. We do have a very diverse audience on the phone. Both presenters hosting this webinar are technical members of our North American DuPont Personal Protection team. So if you have questions related to supply or to ordering, please contact your distributor or DuPont customer service. You'll see at the end of the presentation, we'll have that contact information available. And finally, if you have questions during the webinar, please use the question feature in GoToWebinar to type in your questions. You can get to that by expanding your toolbar with the red or orange arrow icon. We'll have time at the end of the presentation to answer those questions. With that, I'll hand it off to Mark and Dan to introduce themselves. Mark?
Well, thank you everybody for attending today's webinar. My name is Mark Tartaglia, and I'm the lead for the Certified Industrial Hygienist team that supports the DuPont Personal Protection business. We have a team of 3 CIHs that provide technical support to the business. So there's a good chance in the past, if you've had any technical questions related to Kevlar, Nomex, Tyvek, or Tychem, you would have been connected to one of the members of the CIH team. Dan, why don't you introduce yourself, please?
Thank you, Mark. Good afternoon, everybody, or good morning, depending upon where in the world you are. My name is Dan Bowen. I'm the technical specialist for DuPont Protection Technologies for North America. In my role, number one, I rely heavily on Mark and his team for help. But in my role, an awful lot of what I get involved in is trying to help end users determine what is the most appropriate PPE for their particular hazard. And then, of course, folks that are using our product, if they have questions or issues as they put those products into use, I get a lot of calls in that area as well. So with that, Catherine, I was wondering if you could possibly advance to the next slide. As we get started here, I want to take a minute to provide some guidance or some information on some of the activities DuPont has done in the last 4 to 6 weeks to help the world respond to this particular new challenge. While this one is new, it's certainly not the first unusual incident that we've had happen to either America or the world. You know, if we go back as far as 9/11, that was certainly an unusual incident that required some response afterwards. We've had other pandemic-type response incidences. The most recent one in memory was going to be Ebola. We've had avian bird flu incidents, SARS, MERS. We had incidents with anthrax and ricin being sent through the mail. And generally what happens is when these unusual events happen in our country and around the world, agencies and people and organizations turn to PPE manufacturers for help and guidance in those responses. And this one is really no different in that all of us who make PPE, and DuPont's not the only manufacturer in the world that provides personal protective equipment. We've all had to step up and find ways to increase the products that are available, get them to market quicker, so that we can indeed provide the response we need. So as far as a current update, DuPont has got manufacturing operations in 9 different countries, and of course across those 9 countries, we've got 19 different garment production sites, which we refer to internally as cut and sew operations. We've tripled our capacity in the last few weeks here. We're currently up to over 9 million garments per month being produced. In addition, some of you may have seen on the news or in tweets the Project Air Bridge that's going on. DuPont's directly involved with that with some of the air freight carriers. Those air freight carriers are helping us to expedite the transport of raw materials to those cut and sew operations, and then the transportation back to the States of those finished goods. So we're very much involved with Project Air Bridge. In addition, there's certainly areas of the country that are being hit harder than others. Last week, we donated 57,000 coveralls to the 10 states that have the highest incident and death rates of the coronavirus. And of course, with all of these incidents, we have a close relationship, partnership, communication with all those things with the government agencies that are involved in the response, whether that's at the international level with the World Health Organization or closer to home with organizations like the CDC, the FDA, kind of the traditional 3- and 4-letter organizations that help us through these things. The last item I want to talk about is we've had a lot of organizations, manufacturing facilities, individuals step up and say, hey, I'd like to be able to help in this effort. I'd like to be able to make garments. How do I get my hands on roll goods, or how do I get my hands on Tyvek to be able to cut and sew? This week we're announcing something called Project ACE. What Project ACE is a new type of Tyvek called 1222A, which is going to be made available to those folks who do have an interest in obtaining Tyvek fabric so that they can indeed cut and sew isolation gowns and lab coats, etc. As part of that program, we're also making our patterns available as well as how-to videos. Later on in the end of this presentation, there will be a couple of slides with links on them, and if you have an interest in the Project ACE or that Tyvek 1222A material, there will be a link in a later slide that will provide you information on how you can contact us and get engaged on that program. With that, I'll turn it back over to Mark.
So I'm going to briefly review the agenda for today's webinar. So we'll begin by reviewing considerations for selecting PPE with an emphasis on protective garments. Next, we'll share our guidance and resources for the proper donning and doffing of our coveralls. Since the emergence of the COVID-19 pandemic, DuPont honestly has received a tsunami of related questions and inquiries. So we're also going to share responses to a couple of the more common, frequently asked questions. And then finally, we'll open up the webinar to Q&A from the audience. Catherine previously mentioned that questions could be submitted through the chat and question features of the webinar. Next slide, please. So pretty sure that everyone attending today's webinar is well aware that emergency declarations have been declared by the U.S. government as well as the WHO related to COVID that have resulted in supply limitations for a variety of PPE. As a leading provider of protective apparel globally, this has had a significant impact on our business. Dan has previously mentioned a number of ways that DuPont is responding to meet this increased demand. Just like most businesses, though, DuPont is looking to the U.S. government, and in particular the CDC, as well as the WHO, for guidance on really how to best respond to the crisis. So what we have on this slide here is a list of a number of these resources that we have found helpful. In the top section there, the first three links there are for US-based resources, so the CDC and FEMA. We also have the link to the WHO coronavirus site. In the lower section, there's a couple of additional resources that we have found very useful. The first one is a CDC resource where they share strategies for users of PPE to optimize their supply. So that's a good one to refer to. And then the last one is the CDC's guidance for cleaning and disinfection. Next slide, please. So the first step in the PPE selection process, and that includes protective apparel, is to perform a hazard risk assessment. So this slide outlines the considerations that you want to incorporate into an assessment. And without going through each step in detail, there's just a couple of key takeaways when conducting your assessment that we'd like you to take away from this slide. One is the bottom line is by going through your risk assessment, you're basically answering, okay, what's the hazard? or hazards that I'm dealing with, and what am I doing with it? What am I doing with those hazards? How am I handling those hazards? How are those hazards potentially exposing workers? The other key takeaway that we want everybody to recognize is that, as safety professionals, we're always applying the hierarchy of controls to protect workers. And by so doing, we recognize then that PPE is the last line of defense in terms of protection. That being said, we also recognize that given the challenges associated with frontline response to this pandemic, that there obviously is a very heavy dependence on PPE for protecting workers. Next slide, please. So after completing the hazard risk assessment, the next steps in garment selection process involve considering three key elements. You can see those in the triangle above, those being fabric, seam, and design. So again, what are the best fabric options that you may have available for a garment, or in the case of a glove material? And this is going to be driven by what hazard or hazards that you're dealing with. And again, you've identified those during your hazard risk assessment. You can see to the left there, you can see a pictorial of the DuPont portfolio of protective garments, starting on the left-hand side with the lower level protective garments. We refer to those as general protective garments. That's primarily our Pro Shield garments. Then moving up the ladder, you've got our Tyvek garments that are in blue, higher level of protection, and then up to the upper level, which are Tychem garments, which provide a higher level, including chemical protection. Secondly, you need to determine what is the appropriate seam construction for your garment. And that is going to be driven by the level of exposure to the garment. So how much of the material is getting on the garment, what's the duration that material is going to be sitting on the garment. To the right on the slide, you can see the three different seam constructions that DuPont garments can be found with. Starting with the lowest level of protection, that would be a sewn seam garment. So that very much like the type of seams that we have on our regular clothes, except they're done with much stronger sewing and a much stronger thread for those particular sewn thread garments. Next step up from there is a bound seam. There you've got that sewn seam, which is inverted, so it's pointing to the outside of the garment. Then you have another layer of fabric, which is sewn over the top of that. So that will provide a higher level of both protection from particle and liquid penetration through that seam. And then ultimately, the highest level of protection is obtained from a tape seam garment. And the tape seam is basically that sewn seam, which has a layer of fabric heat sealed over the top of that so that it's hermetically sealed. After that, you're asking yourself, what is the appropriate garment design that I need? And garment design is driven by both level and the direction of exposure that the garment is going to experience. And here we just have a couple of pictorials here that show the types of range of designs that we have. You can see coveralls with both attached and no attached hood. You could see apron or isolation gown design, sleeves, boot covers. Again, we have a wide variety of different design options to choose from. Next slide, please. Dan is going to take that over now and talk to you about different fabric technologies incorporated into our garments.
Thank you, Mark. So in these unprecedented times, we're seeing people basically using whatever they can get their hands on to provide some degree of protection from the hazards that they're working with, whether it's biological organisms, microorganisms, cleaning agents, etc. Thought it's worth taking a moment here to review the different material types that are used in general protection fabrics. And for the most part, these are all available as, what I would generically call a white suit. Even though they all might have the same color, these fabrics are really very different in terms of their construction, their materials, and their barrier performance. So going from the bottom to the top, briefly, the lowest level of protection that's out there is a material which is called spun-bond polypropylene. Basically, this is hairnet material. When you see people wearing garments that you can actually see through and see their clothing or other details underneath, that is usually going to be spun-bonded polypropylene. Provides very low level of protection. It's highly breathable, very low cost material, but because it is so breathable and it is such a lightweight material, it doesn't have a high degree of protection against particulate or liquid type hazards. The next fabric up that hierarchy, if you will, is something referred to as SMS, which stands for spun bond, melt blown spun bond. Think of this material as a sandwich. The two outer layers of the sandwich, or the bread of the sandwich, would be that spun-bonded polypropylene material, that hairnet material. Then in between there's a layer of a melt-blown material. It's the same polymer, it's the same plastic, it's usually polypropylene, but the way that is manufactured, it's not extruded into little fibers, it's melt-blown into a layer that kind of looks like a paper towel. So SMS is once again, it's a very breathable material. It does have better particle holdout, very limited liquid resistance, but for light splash, it may be effective. But that's SMS. Moving up that pyramid, the next material technically is referred to as microporous film. I don't like to use that term because it gives you the perception that it is porous. Really, a better description for this material is film laminated. The way this material is manufactured is polypropylene is the substrate, that's spun-bonded polypropylene, and then a layer of plastic is laminated to the surface of that. And I'm going to back up for a second. DuPont does offer a number of these materials. Our SMS fabric is something referred to as ProShield 10. We do have a range of garment styles available in ProShield 10. Our microporous film or film laminated product is referred to as ProShield 50 and ProShield 60. And those materials, there's positive and negatives with them. The positive is because it's a film laminated suit, it provides a pretty good barrier against particles and liquid splash. The negative is because it is a film laminated suit or a plastic laminated suit, it does get a little bit hot to wear. And I always caution people to realize that film layer that's on the outside is fairly fragile. So if you're going to have a very high degree of exposure to for example, a hazardous liquid chemical, a sanitizing agent, for example, that garment might need to be used with some caution just based upon that film layer being somewhat susceptible. And then, of course, at the top, we've got Tyvek. Tyvek is 100% high-density polyethylene that's flash spun. Tyvek is a great, very lightweight material with outstanding particle holdout, and it has very good liquid splash protection as well. Depending upon what that liquid is, there are a couple of things that may find their way through it, but for the most part, it's a good material for light liquid splash. So those are the main fabric technologies that you'll find being used in protective apparel. And once again, they're all a little bit different in terms of their physical structure and also a little bit different in terms of their barrier properties. Next slide, please, Catherine.
All right, this is Mark. I'm going to be taking over again. So with the advent of emerging crises, and this is something Dan mentioned before, we believe that DuPont does a pretty good job at issuing information and guidance in the form of related technical information. So this was the case for hurricanes like Hurricane Sandy, oil spills, and previous biological emergencies like anthrax and SARS and MERS. We've done the same thing with the emergence of COVID-19 by issuing a technical bulletin back in February that provides information on hazards related to coronaviruses, including SARS and MERS, as well as some available protective apparel options that we offer. So this slide and the next couple slides show some of our apparel options along with the performance testing that's related to each type. So on this first slide here, on the left-hand side, we can see two hooded garments, two hooded coveralls, and some boot covers. And these particular garments have been tested against the ASTM F1670 and ASTM F1671 tested and passed those tests, which are tests for blood and viral penetration. Moving over to the right-hand side of the slide, at the top, you'll see a Tyvek, and you'll see that Tyvek is tested and passes for fluid and particle resistance, according to the AAT-CC test. Then at the bottom of the slide, you've got a ProClean isolation gown that's been tested for isolation gown fluid resistance and satisfies level 3 resistance for that test. Next slide, please. On this second slide, you'll see we have a series of additional Tyvek garments. These Tyvek garments are made of Tyvek fabrics that have a higher level of both chemical resistance and particle resistance. And these particular garments have been tested according to the European ISO testing, and have passed that testing for that blood and viral penetration. Next slide, please. And then last year, DuPont had launched a line of Tychem gloves, so chemical resistant gloves. And within that product portfolio, there are 4 nitrile gloves that are seen on this slide that have been tested and passed that same European ISO method that we previously spoke about for blood and viral penetration. So in addition to garment options, we do have some glove resistant options to offer as well. Next slide, please. So to summarize the PPE selection process, we're starting off by completing a hazard risk assessment. Next, for garments then, we're going to determine what are appropriate fabric, seam, and design that we need to incorporate into our garment selection. And then once we have identified available options, we need to select ultimately what we're going to put into practice. We're not done at that point, right? Of course, additionally, we need to ensure that we're training workers to properly use their PPE. And for part of that process, training needs to include instruction on proper donning and doffing of PPE. And Dan is going to pick up the discussion here and discuss donning and doffing for coveralls.
Thank you, Mark. So donning and doffing, if you've never heard those terms before, they're just really fancy names for putting the garment on and taking the garment off. Putting the garment on seems fairly straightforward. Taking the garment off is an area where we have to exercise a little bit of additional caution. As some of you on the call may be aware, many of the exposure incidents that happened early on during the Ebola situation were care workers who were exposed to the virus through the improper doffing procedure. In other words, they were taking the garment off in such a way that they were having contact, direct, skin contact with material from the outside of the suit. So doffing is very important. One of the things that's also needs to be considered while we're talking about the garments in this particular presentation, there are other elements of your PPE configuration that users have to be trained and aware of how to properly use them, put them on, take them off. Things like their respiratory protection. People are going to use a range of different respiratory products. They might be using something as simple as an N95 mask, but more common, people are going to be using something like a cartridge style respirator. They might be using a full face piece respirator. They might be using a powered air purifying respirator or a PAPR. So there's a range of other equipment that people are going to be utilizing with their PPE configuration that they need to understand very thoroughly, both how to use it and how to properly take it off. Next slide, please, Catherine. What we'd like to do now is run through some videos. By the way, at the end of this presentation, everybody will have access to a PDF of this with all these links live, so you guys will have access to this. What we've done at DuPont is prepared a number of videos on donning and doffing protective apparel. So when you get your PDF, these are all actually going to be live links. We're going to run through two of them today. The two we're going to run through are going to be donning and doffing unassisted. In other words, the individual can put the garment on and take it off themselves. The last two videos you see on this particular slide are a little bit more complex garment configuration. It's going to be a hooded coverall with a storm flap that goes all the way around the neck. For some of those more complicated configurations, it's usually beneficial for both donning and doffing to have an assistant available to help you. And the donning side, you want to make sure that if you're going to be taping up your closure systems or you're going to use respiratory equipment, that assistant can take a look at your PPE configuration to make sure everything is assembled and put together properly before you go into the hazardous environment. And of course, the doffing process, hooded coveralls. In many cases, it's very beneficial to have somebody who's also wearing the appropriate level of PPE help you take those garments off to minimize contamination. So what we're going to do now is we're going to show a video of the donning technique, proper donning technique for an individual to put them on. One of the things that's not going to be mentioned at the beginning of this, which is probably important to also note, and Mark is going to speak to this after these videos, these garments are brand new that my assistant is going to be donning. If you happen to be reusing PPE, whether that's a N95 respirator that's been through a sanitization process, whether it's a PAPR, right? It's a piece of equipment that's been used before, or potentially a garment. It's important that you do a visual inspection as well, just to make sure that all the snaps, the closure systems, the seams, the straps, etc., are all in good working order. So, this particular video is going to feature all brand new materials. But if you were reusing PPE, please make sure that you take that extra moment to do that visual inspection. With that, Catherine, you can let it roll.
Thanks, Dan.
And in this video, we're going to review the donning procedures for a Tyvek protective coverall. This is going to be a self-donned garment. My assistant Matt is going to demonstrate. So we have a chair behind Matt. Always a good idea to have a chair available for both donning and doffing protective apparel, whether that's general protection garments or Tyvek chemical resistant garments. The first thing that Matt's going to do is he's going to put some sort of protective foot cover on. Anytime you're wearing a garment configuration because you're working with hazardous materials, whether it's chemical, biological, particulate, whatever in nature, chances are you're going to be using some sort of protective foot cover. Once he's got the protective foot cover on while he's still sitting, he's going to take the Tyvek coverall, came out of the package, we're going to unfold it. Don't need to unzip it. And it's certainly easiest to put this on while still sitting down, at least up around your waist. Okay, the next thing Matt will probably do is put on his inner gloves. We use a two-layer glove system. Remember that inner glove is your last layer of protection, the last line of defense. That is going to be the last thing that comes off when it's time to remove this garment after it has been used for whatever the particular application is you're using it for. Now Matt can stand up. He's going to bring that garment up over his shoulders. Going to zip the garment up. Okay. Now this particular garment has a storm flap covering the zipper. There is no self-adhesive on this storm flap. However, next to Matt is a roll of Tyvek tape. You could also use duct tape, but you could take some form of tape and use it to secure that storm flap down over the top of the zipper. Then the last thing Matt's going to do is he's going to apply the outer glove. Remember, we're going to use a two-layer glove system. The outer glove system is intended to receive the contaminant material. The inner glove is their last line of defense and the last thing that's going to come off after we remove this garment. And remember, this particular coverall has no hood. We do offer garments with hoods as well. At this point, Matt would utilize whatever sort of respiratory and eye protection he was going to utilize, whether it be a half-face piece respirator, a pair of goggles or safety glasses, a PAPR, or a full-face piece respirator.
Thank you, Catherine. Now we're going to proceed to the proper doffing procedure. And once again, as you watch this, remember the main focus on doffing is to make sure you're doing it in such a way that the wearer, their clothing, their skin does not come in contact with the potentially contaminated outside area of that suit.
Hello, this is Dan with DuPont Personal Protection, and in this video we're going to review the doffing procedures for a Tyvek coverall. This is the procedure that a person would use if they're going to be doing self-doffing. Remember, the doffing term is really nothing more than another name for taking the garment off. This particular procedure, what we need to be cautious of is the fact that the outside of this garment may contain contaminants. So my assistant Matt is going to remove the garment in such a way as to eliminate, hopefully, or at least minimize the potential for contact with his clothing or skin. So the first thing Matt's going to do is he's going to remove his outer gloves. Remember, we used a two-layer glove system when we put this garment on. In theory, the inner gloves are now free of contaminants. Now Matt's going to reach up and unzip the front of that garment all the way down. Once he's got it unzipped, he's going to reach up to the collar area and carefully roll that garment back so that the outside edges or outside surface of the garment does not touch his clothing. He's going to continue rolling that down just a little ways. Now the next thing he's going to do is carefully, using his gloved hands, reach up and pull those sleeves, the contaminated sleeves, down over the glove. Remove one hand, then do the same thing on the other side. Next, he's going to reach up and continue to roll that garment down, basically rolling it against itself so that the outside of the garment only touches the outside. Going to roll it all the way down. He's got a chair behind him. Once again, as I said in other videos, it's useful to have a chair or a bench for doffing. Going to roll that garment all the way down once again, making sure that the outside of the garment does not touch his clothing, his skin, or his hands. Going to remove the garment over the boot covers that he's wearing. Okay. Next, his foot protection will come off. Once again, same drill. He's going to be very careful to have the outside of that shoe cover or boot cover not come in contact with any skin, clothing. Removes the other one. Right. And then the very last thing he's going to do is remove the gloves, turning them inside out as they come off. That one gets wadded up into the hand of the first one, reaches inside with his thumb, rolls that glove over the other one. Done. Self-doffing procedure for a Tyvek coverall.
So thank you. The only other thing to consider is remember that after that garment has been removed, it's a hazardous waste product at that point. So whatever your procedure is to handle potentially infectious materials or hazardous materials, the garment needs to be treated accordingly because it will potentially have contamination on it, and it is now hazardous waste. With that, I'm going to turn it back over to Mark.
Mark, you might be on mute.
Indeed, I was. My apologies, everybody. So as we had said in our agenda that we were going to shift gears here now, and we're going to talk about some of the common frequently asked questions that we've been receiving. And without a doubt, the most common one is around the reuse of our garments. So with regard to Tyvek garments, we really have to start out by making sure that everybody understands that Tyvek garments are designed and sold as a single-use product. So consequently, DuPont cannot recommend that they be reused regardless of any sort of disinfection or treatment that they're subjected to. And why is that? Well, there are 4 criteria that need to be met to allow for the safe reuse of PPE, even Tychem garments, Tyvek garments. And we are not aware of any decontamination method at this time anyway that meets all 4 of these criteria. And what are those criteria? So they're listed here on the slide. So first, the treatment method needs to be harmless to the user, to the wearer of the garment. Secondly, it needs to ensure that treatment method has no negative impact on the original performance properties for the garment. Thirdly, the treatment needs to remove the biological threat. In this case, we're talking about a viral threat. And lastly, the treatment cannot compromise the integrity of the garment. So not only the fabric, we have to remember, right, that the garment has a number of other components associated with it. So we can't have any negative impact on things like the thread or the tape, zippers, etc. So as a result, our first suggestion to end users is to follow CDC's guidance for optimizing your supplies of PPE. And again, I mentioned that guidance earlier, and there's a link again here to that guidance. Now, even by employing CDC strategies for optimization, honestly, frontline organizations are still experiencing PPE shortages, and we certainly recognize this. However, our position is that reuse of PPE should be a last resort. Next slide, please. That being said, while we do not recommend the treatment and reuse of Tyvek garments, we do have a document available that provides information on the impact to Tyvek from a variety of different treatment methods. The document contains info on the effects from some of the more common disinfection methods that we're seeing out there associated with COVID-19 response. So there's some information there on ultraviolet and gamma radiation, ethylene oxide treatment or treatment with vapor hydrogen peroxide, autoclaving treatment, steam autoclaving treatment, dry heat treatment, washing by laundering, and surface chemical treatment. So the web link for that document is here. I encourage you, if you want more information, to take a look at that. But at this point, we need to stress that we have no information. We've got no data on the effectiveness of any of these treatment methods on COVID-19 related to our Tyvek garments. And again, you know, it's always best to base your decisions on data. And unfortunately, at this point, we don't have that data. Next slide, please. So organizations we find are also using Tychem garments, and Tychem garments would be a garment of choice for the higher level chemical disinfection methods that are being used associated with COVID-19 response. So consequently, we've been getting inquiries about their reuse as well. So we have put together some information about Tychem garments in their disinfection and reuse. So first, to understand the difference between a Tyvek and a Tychem garment. Again, a Tyvek garment is a single-use garment. Tychem garments, on the other hand, are what we refer to as multiple-use, single exposure garments. So as long as they've not been contaminated, altered, or damaged, they can be reused. However, in the case of COVID-19 response, you know, there's a high probability that these garments are going to be subjected to surface contamination. So there is a four-step reuse process that we have outlined in the document. First step would be cleaning the exterior of the garment with warm water and a mild detergent using a soft brush. After that, disinfection of the exterior of the garment with some recommended disinfectant method. CDC is recommending potentially bleach or disinfectants off of the EPA registration list. Subsequent to disinfection, you're going to want to wash with fresh water, rinse with fresh water the exterior of the garment, and then air dry. As Dan mentioned previously, a critical last step is going to be to inspect those garments prior to use. And the guidance we have provided has a very detailed inspection process to go through prior to reuse. The other piece is similar to Tyvek. In the case of Tyvek, we really don't have any data or guidance on the number of times that a garment could be safely cleaned and reused. Next slide, please. So this slide is another reference slide with resource information. At the top, you can see the link for the Tyvek cleaning and reuse document that I just mentioned. There's a link here for the list of EPA registered disinfectants that we've discussed, a link for CDC's guidance on cleaning and disinfection. And then the CDC also has provided some guidance on donning and doffing, and we've decided to include that link as well. Catherine, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Awesome. Thank you, Mark. So a big part of our goal today was to make sure that you had access to our latest resources and all of the resources out there that we've been referring to. So Dan mentioned this, but we'll be sending out a PDF version of the presentation with all of the active links. And then on this slide, we just wanted to summarize a few additional resources as well. The first two links are all of our information related to DuPont's COVID-19 response. So on that first link, you can find additional FAQs. You can find the coronavirus technical bulletin that Mark referred to earlier, and a variety of other resources. And the second link goes to our Tyvek Together program. So at the beginning of the webinar, Dan mentioned our 1222A fabric. If you're interested in learning more about that, that second link is for you, and you can register your interest with us there. I've also included some links to our DuPont personal protective equipment site. So if you have questions on all of our brands, Kevlar, Nomex, Tyvek, and Tychem, that would be the resource to go to. We have an online product selector tool and product catalog called SaySpec. If you have specific questions regarding certain garment styles, that would be the best resource to go out to at this point. And finally, we also have a resource center. So if you're looking for specific information, it allows you to search kind of all of the different documentation that we have out there. We don't sell our products direct. So if you're interested in buying, our where to buy page goes to our the distributors that we work with. And finally, you can see here our customer service number. And the big takeaway, please contact us if you have questions. We're happy to help. And on this next slide, you should already have my contact information. Again, my name's Catherine Breer when you signed up for the webinar. And here's Dan and Mark's contact information as well. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Steve, who has been going through the questions as they've come in. If you do have questions, please enter them into the question function and go to webinar. And Steve, handing it off to you.
Great, thank you, Catherine. Dan and Mark, so you know, I'm going to go through the questions in the order that they came in. If you would like to read them as I ask them out loud, you can open that box as well. So first question we have is in regard to looking for recommendations for a dental office that is recommending PPE use.
Well, I'd be willing to take that question, and it's kind of hard to give specific guidance on that. Again, it comes down to doing that hazard risk assessment. Again, identifying exactly what the hazards are, and how are your PPE going to be potentially exposed, and then based on that, making selections. So again, if you determine that you needed a garment that passed For instance, the blood and viral penetration testing. If you remember back to that slide there, certain garments pass that. If you decided that you needed a lower level of fluid in liquid resistance, perhaps it would be a Tyvek garment. And again, you've got a variety of options there. But really, it's going to be based off of your hazard risk assessment and then going through the garment selection process. Dan, do you have anything else to add?
The only thing I'd add is, in recent years, the dental industry has really upped its game in terms of protection for both the patient as well as the dental care professional, whether that be a dental assistant or the dentist themselves. Obviously, when we're working inside someone's mouth in the COVID era, there's a higher degree of concern over contamination, and historically, the doctors and the dentists, technicians, you've been good in terms of the gloves, the autoclaving, the equipment, etc. You may want to consider looking at something like sleeves or a disposable type sleeved apron versus the reusable cloth frocks or smocks that are generally being used, so that you've got something that after you're done with a single patient, you have the ability to dispose of that garment, as opposed to number one, either running the risk of contamination for the dental employee, or number two, the subsequent patients.
Great, thank you. We have two questions in here around breathability, so I'm going to try to combine them. If you guys can speak a little more about the breathability between the different fabrics that we covered, and as well if there's been any guidance on breathability needs for or against COVID-used coverall.
Yeah, so I'll start. So breathability is always it's a double-edged sword, right? Everybody that has to wear PPE, and I don't care what it is, right? You want to wear the lightest weight material you can possibly get away with, because the concern is heat stress, right? And the burden on the human being. Unfortunately, when it comes to being protected from hazards in the workplace or hazards in general, there is no such thing as PPE that's going to be as comfortable as wearing a pair of gym shorts and a t-shirt, right? It's just the nature of the beast. And what you find is that with increased breathability, the protection level generally goes down. The highest level of protection material is absolutely positively impervious, like a level A suit, and it is absolutely a hell-like experience to wear one of those things. So the challenge you have is really going back to what Mark had provided in terms of guidance on your hazard assessment, right? When we're dealing with infectious diseases, there's a range of functions that people are going to perform in a potentially contaminated environment. It might be someone in a clinic processing people in or taking temperatures. It could be somebody on a cruise ship working with a high volume of liquid disinfectant material that's highly likely to end up with a large amount of liquid exposure. Obviously, if you've got a lot of liquid disinfectant exposure or breathable garment, it's just not going to provide protection from that hazardous chemical that's going to be being used to decontaminate. So, the breathability thing is always a challenge, because as you come to a more comfortable, more breathable garment, your protection level goes down, and it's a historical trade-off. And it really comes down to those two questions. What are you dealing with, and what are you doing with it, and what's the appropriate PPE? And that the answer to that question may not be the most comfortable garment in the world. You may end up having to deal with some degree of physical discomfort or heat stress, because it's the right level of protection for the job that you're doing or the hazard you're working with. Mark, anything to add?
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that, when you're looking at the garment selection, I think you have to look at performance also as a hierarchy. And, that hierarchy is protecting the worker first, durability of the garment second, and comfort third. And, balancing those things is oftentimes a difficult task. But again, ultimately, we have to be thinking of what's the proper level of protection for the worker first.
Yeah, and the only other thing I'd add to that is, depending upon what people are working with, there are certain applications where the PPE is being decontaminated with a liquid solution. Obviously, a very breathable garment is not going to stand up at all well to that process. So, if the job that you're going to be doing, whatever it happens to be, involves some sort of a liquid decontamination material being sprayed on the wearer before they doff that garment, obviously a breathable fabric is not going to be suitable for that particular application.
Great, thank you. There is another question here around microporous film, wondering if the film coating is on the inside or outside of the garment. So against the skin or against the environment.
Yeah, normally it's going to be on the outside of the garment. The logic there is you wouldn't want the contaminant soaking into that fabric on the outside of it. You know, a lot of things will splash off. You want that protection not just for the wearer, but also for the substrate as well. So historically, that material is going to be on the outside. There is actually one other fabric technology that I didn't have on that slide called SFS, where the film is laminated in the middle. There's going to be fabric on the outside, a layer of film in the middle, and more fabric on the inside. In some cases, those fabrics are going to have a little bit higher level of performance because the fabric on the outside is actually going to protect that fragile layer of film. So SFS is another fabric technology that you'll find out there. It does tend to be a heavier fabric to wear, but the whole logic there is to protect that fragile layer of plastic or laminate on by putting something over the top of it. But on a microporous film, it's generally going to be on the outside of the garment.
Great. Not sure if you can speak to this, but we do have a question about ultraviolet disinfection and if it's harmful to N95 masks as well as Tyvek or Tychem garments.
One of the things you need to realize with UV is that all of these polymer type materials, ultraviolet light does tend to not necessarily contaminate them, but it will physically break them down. UV is particularly aggressive in terms of the physical strength of materials. So the concern there is the quantity of UV radiation that they receive, and whether hitting something with a real hard dose of ultraviolet light could conceivably embrittle or weaken those materials some. Mark, anything to add?
Yeah, I would say there is information on the effects of UV light on Tyvek within the guidance document that I referred to previously. So I would suggest that you refer to that. Similarly, there's general guidance on UV disinfection from the CDC. And again, I go back to that point about it's not just the fabric. When I'm reading about N95 respirators, it's more so on the straps that UV has a negative impact on the straps than necessarily the filter media.
Great. There is a question here on elaborating on flash spun HDPE. Is it more like a film or standalone in regard to laminated base layers, or is it rugged like a flash spun bond?
So the HDPE, high density polyethylene, is the material that Tyvek is made from, and it's probably worth going through just a quick verbal description of what that process is, and it's really what makes Tyvek a unique material. The closest analogy I've ever been able to come up with is cotton candy. When we've probably all gone to the carnival and we've seen a cotton candy machine, and it's a thick mat, if you will, or a thick layer of just randomly sprayed down fibers of sugar. Well, Tyvek starts its life a lot like that. What we do is we spray a thick mat of randomly sprayed down, very thin fibers of high-density polyethylene that looks an awful lot like white cotton candy, and then we use heat and pressure to squeeze that together. So there's no barrier film involved in Tyvek. Microporous film, the difference there is it's usually going to be polypropylene as opposed to high-density polyethylene. And once again, the fabric substrate is going to be that spun bond polypropylene material, which under a microscope kind of looks like monofilament fishing line, very uniform size and shape on those fibers, and then a thin layer of polypropylene type material is going to be, basically like a handy wrap or a saran wrap, right? It's going to be laminated to the surface of that material, and that's really the physical difference between a laminated film type substrate and a Tyvek substrate.
Thank you.
I would just add one of the advantages there, right? For Tyvek, it's 100% Tyvek from top to bottom, from inside and out. So again, from a durability perspective, right? If something scratches that, or you get a top layer, perhaps somehow braided away, you've got 100% Tyvek underneath that.
Thank you. I'm going to combine two questions, so two parts here, Dan and Mark. In regards to decontamination and reusing the Tychem garments, public safety agencies are having very limited supply. Are there any guidelines for simply allowing time to kill off the COVID virus? And then the second question to this is, are Tyvek garments able to be washed in front-load washing machines in an institutional setup?
So I'm willing to take that, Dan, and then you could add into that as well. So repeat the first part of the question. I'm sorry. I was thinking of the laundry first.
No problem. Pretty much, are there any guidelines around allowing the virus to just die off on Tyvek garment?
Yeah. Again, we don't have any information on the effectiveness of any treatment for either Tyvek or Tychem garments. So the answer is no, we don't have any data out there. Again, if you go to CDC or you look at anecdotal information, that is a suggested potential method for getting rid of COVID-19. But again, we have no data that suggests that would work. So, second part of the question
was around laundering.
Yeah. So again, there is information in the Tyvek reuse document that we have around laundering. If you look at unused garments, and if you look within our clean room garment portfolio, we've got ISO clean garments, which actually do get laundered as part of the process. So there is information related to that within the Tyvek reuse document. So I would refer you to that expanded information there.
Thank you. And there are many questions coming in around sewing with our fabrics. So I'm going to reiterate when we send the slides out later this week, you will have the contact information on how to access our contact who's managing that process of gaining material with the patterns, and they'll be able to further expand on whether it is able to be used for the public safety agencies as well. I've seen a few questions in here on that one. So for the sake of time, one second, guys, I lost my spot. Sorry about that.
Yeah, looks like we have time for one or two more questions.
Yes. So we do have a question here on, can you comment on the applicability of using Tyvek suits for COVID protection in an area that also requires FR protection? What are our options?
So I'll take that one. So Tyvek, as I said just a minute ago, is high-density polyethylene, which is not an FR material. And in fact, being a polymer or a plastic-type material, if you get exposed to flame, it will melt, drip, burn, shrink wrap you, turn you into a flaming marshmallow. Those are all terms that I generally try to drive the point home about if you've got a flash fire hazard, that Tyvek is really not the correct solution. We do have products that could potentially be suitable for that. We've got a material called ProShield 6 SFR, which is a chemically treated wood pulp type material, which is going to provide some degree of particle holdout. It's not Tyvek. It's not going to be liquid proof, And then the other material we do have, which really is a step up, is something called Tychem 2000 SFR. As Mark had said earlier, our Tychem product line is really focused on chemical protection. However, all of the Tychem fabrics pass ASTM 1671 vibro penetration testing. The Tychem 2000 SFR is a secondary flame retardant material which also has chemical resistance against acids and bases. So it should be very effective in terms of chemical resistance against any of the caustic cleaning agents people would use. And it does provide that level of secondary FR protection as well, so you won't be compromising the safety of the workers if, God forbid, a flash did occur.
Thank you for all the questions. And I do recognize there's a few in here that we were not able to get to. We will try to follow up separately, but you have our contact information here if you want to ask individual questions to either Mark or Dan. And with that, I will close up the Q&A portion and give it back over to Catherine for closing remarks.
Great, thank you, Taylor. So with that, we will collect the questions and then be reaching out to folks individually if we didn't get to your question. Thank you for attending today. And again, expect this PDF presentation with all of the links in it in your email box, likely within the next day. So thank you again for attending.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you very much for spending the time with us today.
Indeed. Thanks, everyone.